Okay, so what I'm going to do for you here is a think aloud, which means I'm taking a prompt that I haven't really thought about, and I'm going to try to slow down my thinking process and speed up my writing process so that you can see one way to think about a prompt, one way to answer a prompt. This doesn't mean that this is a definitive answer to this prompt. This is just going to be one that would work. Again, I haven't really thought too much about the prompt. I read it quickly, said, oh, this will work as a practice prompt. And that's pretty much it. I also haven't studied for the test, but the idea here is to just sort of use what I have in terms of my mind right now, which is only on 1 cup of coffee. But anyway, let's get started. So here I go. I'm going to start with reading the prompt and marking it up to label my part and whole. A critic has said that one important measure of a superior work of literature is its ability to produce in the reader a healthy confusion of pleasure and disquietude. Using MacBeth, write a well-organized essay in which you explain the sources of pleasure and disquietude experienced by the readers/audience of the play. Explain how this healthy confusion, so that's the part, right? The confusion of pleasure and disquietude illuminates the meaning of the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize. Now, we haven't done anything in class together yet to talk about the meaning of the work as a whole, because obviously we can't really do that until we finish the play. So that's going to be a little extra challenge because I don't have those topics in the front of my mind necessarily. But you know what? We'll make do. It's going to be all right. So first, I'm going to draw a line here just to remind myself that I need to talk about the part and the whole. So this is just a visual reminder that there are two parts I need to address. The gear, the healthy confusion, and then the meaning of the work as a whole. So some of you might find it more helpful to start by analyzing the part. Others of you might find it more helpful, depending on the prompt, to articulate a whole and then kind of work backwards of like, okay, so how can I support that this is the theme? What sources of pleasure and disquietude can I point to that help prove this theme? I personally tend to analyze the part first, just because then it feels more organic. In fact, I might even write part and whole up here. Again, just to remind myself of the two parts. Okay, pleasure and disquietude. There is a healthy confusion when reading this play. I think much of it stems from, when I think about this, I think part of it is there are these conflicting feelings toward MacBeth. On one hand, we are morally repulsed by him. I think especially toward the end, in the beginning we're kind of on his side, but by the end we very firmly reject him morally. And yet at the same time, at the end, we admire, at least I would argue, that we admire his courage. Even though he knows he's going to die, he faces his impending doom. He learns that Macduff is born from a C-section, so he's technically not of woman born. We see that Macbeth the whole time, toward the end, the last scenes in Act 5, he keeps saying, none of woman born can harm me, and then he kills someone. None of woman born can harm me, and then he kills someone. So he's just going nuts with his sword, but then, so as he depends on that, there's also a foolishness. We sort of see him as a fool of fate or a fool of fortune. I'll decide what word makes more sense. He's a fool because he believes the equivocation of the witches. He was warned that they tell half-truths to betray us in deepest consequence. And yet he depends on it. He makes decisions based on it, and it drives him to madness. But anyway, even though he knows he's about to die, Burnham Wood has indeed come to Dunsinane, and Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. Check out the quotes, man. Maybe I can incorporate those into my essay there. Anyway, he faces them head on in this heroic way. And again, we want to see him die. We want an end to all the murdering that he's doing because we are morally repulsed by him. And at the same time, we admire his courage in the face of certain defeat. So all of this I would be thinking in my head, and obviously not saying out loud during the test. My courage in the face of certain defeat. But as I'm talking, it's helping me, it'd be you thinking through it, right? Thinking about maybe certain phrases. So I feel like there's quite a bit here having to do with Macbeth. When I also think about other parts of like pleasure and disquietude, I'm also thinking about Lady Macbeth. Maybe not. I just started thinking in my head of what pleasure we get from her, and I'm not sure we necessarily get pleasure from her now that I think about it. We certainly get the disquietude of how her story ends. We might like that that she wants power too. There might be something to say about that it almost feels sort of closer to modern women. But the way she goes about it doesn't really bring me pleasure. Calling on demons to help you get power, I'm not sure I can call that pleasure. I'm going to stick with Macbeth. This definitely kind of hits on Aristotle, the definition of tragedy, the notion of Macbeth as a tragic hero. I feel like this question and what happens with Macbeth, they line up nicely. All right, so now let's turn this into some claims. Or maybe I might go to the whole then. This idea, okay, so let me revisit the prompt again. All right, well-organized essay in which you explain the sources of pleasure and disquietude experienced by the reader's audience of the play. Explain how this healthy, so I've got the sources, morally repulsed, everything from giving in to that first step of killing Duncan to his undiscriminating kill after kill in Act 5. Undiscriminating in that he doesn't care who he's killing. It's not like, oh, I should only kill the leader of the English army, or I should only kill Malcolm or Macduff. He doesn't care who's coming at him, he's killing him, right? As in contrast with Macduff, who says he'll keep his sword sheathed until he faces Macbeth. Macduff knows he doesn't need to kill everyone in his path. He knows that the people fighting for Macbeth are half-heartedly fighting for him. They're only fighting for Macbeth because Macbeth has paid them to do so, and they have not abandoned Macbeth, but there's no loyalty in their hearts toward Macbeth. They'll let Macduff pass. They'll let Macduff go and find Macbeth and kill him. So Macduff knows, I don't need to kill everybody. I only need to find Macbeth. There's a nice contrast there. That might work better, though, for some other, possibly for some other prompt. Anyway, Yeah, so we're morally repulsed here. Yes, and admiring his courage in the face of certain defeat. Okay. And that he is a fool of fate and fortune. Certainly, these two things are connected. Part of being morally repulsed is not just the murders, but his sort of investment in the juggling fiends, right? And it's nice because the word fiend kind of connects us to the devil a little bit here. Again, in the Christian framework of the play, we're supposed to be morally repulsed that he finds himself on the same side as the witches in some way, or at least puts so much faith in what they say that he turns his back on his own, probable Christian faith. Okay, so the healthy confusion. I'm debating whether or not right now in my head to do I want to organize it of like a paragraph getting at the pleasure and a paragraph getting at the disquietude. Part of me likes the idea of not organizing it that way. Part of me likes the idea of having a particular moment in which we experience both pleasure and disquietude in a single moment. But my fear with that kind of organization is that I won't be able to fully develop what I want to say here and what I want to fully develop here. To me, it makes sense to begin with the disquietude. Explain how this healthy confusion of pleasure and disquietude eliminates the play. I'm going to start with the disquietude here. And just put that in parentheses for myself so I can make sure that I'm really addressing the prompt here. So when I think about what I said that we are disquieted by, trying to think, now part of me says I need to go to the whole, and that will help me articulate like what my claims are. Let's see. There's something about, I think, fighting in the face of certain doom that is heroic. There's a resilience, there's a grit about Macbeth that is admirable. And I think that that's part of, for me, that's one of the takeaways. You could also argue for the power of fear, respecting fear, and that arguably that was the problem here. Macbeth had no fear in the end. He was fearless, right? Now that was part of what we admire, that courage, and yet at the same time, his abandonment of fear is what led him to doing these horrible things. He no longer feared the witches, that's why he returns to them, and sort of demands that they tell him more. Maybe this is about fear. Maybe is this about respecting a type of fear, or that fearlessness is something to both admire and condemn. I don't like the is, though. I want an action verb. Let's make those into my action verbs. Shakespeare argues that humans should both admire and condemn those who are fearless. Those few. I want to get at the idea that most people have fear, and a lot of times people, and when I think about it, a lot of times people don't take risks that maybe they should because they're so afraid, right? I think everybody has experienced that sort of fear of failure, and the fear of failure can paralyze you, right? Shakespeare's not talking about the fear of failure in that, like, that's not a fear to respect. Fear of failure is not necessarily a fear to respect. Though you could also argue that, you know, when Macbeth is talking to Lady Macbeth about why they should not kill Duncan, you know, he says, and if we fail, and she's like, we fail, right? But screw your courage to the sticking place, etc., right? She's like, and we will not fail. So he did have a fear of failure that perhaps would have prevented him from the horrible first act that he does. So maybe it is partially a fear of failure, but I think here the fearlessness, he's no longer afraid of death. And part of it again is that he knows he's going to hell. Shakespeare argues that humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. Yeah, all right. I think you could argue that he argues that. I just kind of made that up off the top of my head. We didn't talk about fear, you know, till the cows came home or anything like that, but I think you can see how we could argue that that's one of the takeaways. Certainly the fearlessness of Macbeth at the end points to that as an important topic. Banquo as a ghost coming toward him, right? There is the fear of being found out, the fear of going to hell, all those things. Play is about fear, you could argue. And it is a frightful play, right? I mean, it's like a horror movie. All right, I'm convinced that this makes sense. So now let's go back to the question, because I kind of went into teaching mode instead of thinking mode here. Explain the sources of pleasure and disquietude experienced by the readers of the play. Explain how this healthy confusion eliminates the meaning of the work as a whole. He argues that humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. So the disquietude part is readers readers are disquieted. I might revise this. This feels like not great. This is my wording. Readers are disquieted. Readers' disquietude leads to a condemnation. Now it's wordy. Readers Macbeth's morally repulsive actions and foolish, no, I'm starting to get into like naming I don't want to name the examples. I want to connect it to the whole. reader's disquietude, I'll just go back to what I was doing, leads to their condemnation of Macbeth. Reader's disquietude, okay, reader's disquietude leads to their condemnation of Macbeth. Then I know that I'm going to get at the sources of the disquietude, and what I did was I sort of thought in a cause and effect kind of way, and that's what will show that my claim is connected to my holistic meaning. Reader's disquietude leads to their condemnation and rejection of Macbeth. I don't want to start talking about examples in my claim, right? Because examples are not the claim. So I know that within that paragraph, I'm just going to move this over, within that paragraph, I'm going to talk about that we are first disquieted by how easily Macbeth is swayed by his wife. That he didn't stand for his own values. This was sort of like a betrayal of his values here. So, betrayed his own values. I know that, right again, what else it causes disquietude and our condemnation. How easily he's swayed by his wife. And I think part of what we're disquieted by is that we initially identify with him. Right? So that's part of why we're disquieted, because we identified with this person. He seemed like this great hero, and then that susceptibility that he shows us, part of what we're disquieted by is that, hey, we were identifying with this guy, and we're starting to feel a little uneasy here, because we know that we might also be susceptible to certain people in our lives, sort of more open to letting them kind of infect our thinking. So that susceptibility led to his betrayal of his own values, led to killing Duncan. That's all kind of in the same area. Again, I also want to get to thinking about the order. That certainly makes sense to start with in terms of an example. And then, right, he sort of furthers our disquietude when we see him abandoning his wife. Right, so this gets at like abandoning his values. This is abandoning his wife. Again, we see her crumble. We see him go to the witches. Insults witches, leaves Lady Macbeth in the dust. Lady Macbeth crumples alone in the end. In the end, Malcolm suggests that she committed suicide. Of course, we don't quite know with any certainty that that's what happened. There are other possibilities of how she died. But we'll go with a traditional reading and go with this idea that she commits suicide, and part of that is because Macbeth has abandoned her. So we see that he's not a great moral person here. He's not a great husband here. But of course, what is most morally repugnant is the undiscriminating killing at the end. As the tyrant. So I like this because it's also kind of has like an archetypal feel, right? Yeah, there's quite a bit that disquiets us. But now let's shift. So I do want to start with this because I do want to end on that note of there's, and yet, right? That's a transition there. Or despite being morally repulsed, despite all this disquietude that we feel, despite the reader's moral repulsion of Macbeth. Obviously, when I'm actually writing it, I'm going to write out his whole name, but this is all just shorthand for myself. Despite the reader's moral repulsion of Macbeth, I don't want to do a we. Despite the reader's moral repulsion of Macbeth, there is still pleasure and admiration for the protagonist. There is still pleasure and admiration. There's still, well, there is still pleasure and admiration for the protagonist. Okay, not perfect, it's fine, let's just keep going. If I have time, then I'll tweak this to my liking. This feels at pleasure and admiration for is just kind of awkward to me. But anyway, let's just keep going. So I know that I do want to get at this, that what we admire is he fights till the end. He fights against his impending doom. He does not give up. He does not forfeit. He knows he's about to lose, and he fights anyway. He fights in the face of certain defeat. Yeah, there's certainly pleasure there. I think we also experience pleasure, so that's like one, right? That's like one example, and that's clearly one to end on, right? Like if I'm going to have another example, I'm going to want one before that. So like here, I happen to think of them in a pretty decent order. Again, what I'm doing is I'm going back to those like original notes that I just happened to scribble down. I do want to get at the idea that another source of our pleasure is the even-handed justice. We want to see him punished. We want to see him punished for these morally repulsive things that he does, right? It sounds weird to think about the idea of we're pleased that he is punished. It's not like we're not taking pleasure in the psychological torment. What we're taking pleasure in is that it seems justice wins in the end. And there's a major, I think, breath of relief. Once Macbeth is dead, despite our admiration, we are relieved in the end that he is dead, right? And that Malcolm is rightfully restored to the throne. Things feel like they are as they should be. So we do take pleasure in seeing him, you might think idiomatically, he gets what he deserves. He deserves to be abandoned by his nobles. Again, thinking back to the Lady Macduff scene with his kids, that's another one to sort of named specifically, killing the MacBeth family, certainly a good example of him undiscriminatingly killing people for no reason at this point. They had no threat. They have nothing on MacBeth. He really had zero reason other than to just sort of terrorize his own citizens. Yeah. So I'll talk about that. So sometimes, like when we think through one claim, it actually helps us clarify, you know, something else. So be open to that. Of course, yes. Yes, so I'm going to reread the prompt to make sure I'm answering the prompt here and check to see my whole and part. Explain the sources of pleasure and disquietude experienced by the readers and audience of the play. Yes, I definitely do that. Explain how this healthy confusion illuminates the meaning of the work as a whole. I think Shakespeare argues that humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. Again, it centers around the notion of MacBeth as a tragic hero. That feels like something that would likely go in my thesis, which, you know, in a good plan, obviously, we also want to articulate our thesis. So something about tragic hero up here, because that's really what my takeaway, in some sense, kind of gets at. That the healthy confusion that we feel is toward MacBeth himself. There are other things you could do in the play. Shakespeare argues humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. Humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. So now let's articulate the thesis, and then we'll be ready to go. Again, the whole, that when I flesh this out and kind of get at how the healthy confusion is really pointing to this conflicting feeling, right? That the point is to have these conflicting feelings in the reader, but then again, we are relieved when this internal conflict kind of ends with MacBeth's death, right? We are no longer admiring him, we are no longer condemning him. We do sort of, I think, we're relieved when the healthy confusion is released with MacBeth's death. That might be what I do with my conclusion. So normally I might like jot down a couple notes of what I might hit on there. But a lot of times, honestly, like once I go through this, like this is my plan, but once I actually start fleshing this out, getting you know, when the quotes come to mind, that sometimes new meaning is created, and then I have some ideas of like what else I might do with my conclusion. I mean, this is my takeaway. I'm not going to stray from that. But like what I actually do in terms of, so what does all this suggest? Right? And again, I think it goes back to that really that Aristotelian notion of tragedy, that watching tragedies is cathartic for an audience because we sort of temporarily live through it. We have this conflict, this internal conflict of both admiration and condemnation. But then when he dies in the end, we experience the relief that his story's over, the relief of our internal conflict being over, about how to feel about it. All right, enough teaching. Go to the thesis. Okay. Explain how this healthy confusion illuminates the meaning of the work as a whole. Shakespeare elicits both pleasure. Well, wait, I'm going to talk about disquietude first. So I want to do it, I want to have it in my thesis, the order I'm going to treat it. Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure. He elicits both disquietude and pleasure in the reader. Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure in the reader. This is messing me up. Shakespeare elicits, I need another cup of coffee. Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure thinking about like, should I write like toward Macbeth, toward those who are fearless? Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure. Elicits both disquietude and pleasure. To create, I don't know, it's not to create. Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure in the reader. Well, to hook the reader. I don't know if I love this. Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure to hook the reader. Now, to expose Shakespeare elicits both disquietude and pleasure to expose the conflicting condemnation and admiration for those who are fearless. Okay. I'm not going to worry about making this perfect. It's not perfect. But it does show that I clearly understood the question, right? Because I've got the part. I'm naming the part here, right? I'm showing that I understand that that I also need to connect it to the whole, right? And I've used this is almost, I've got some wordage, right? Some verbiage down here. And I've incorporated some of that so that when I get to this in the conclusion, it's not a brand new thing, right? I showed that that was kind of my end goal. That's where I'm headed. So what this does then, the thesis shows I clearly understood the parts of the prompt, the part and the whole. I'm showing you the parts of my essay and the whole that I'm going to get to in the conclusion. I've got how I'm starting my conclusion. I've got my claim, readers' disquietude leads to their condemnation and rejection of Macbeth. Good, right? I'm going to name the examples in there, analyze those, show how that gets us to condemn and reject Macbeth as a person. But you can see it's also linked to the thesis, and that it's also eventually going to help me get to here. Disquietude, condemnation. Then up here, or over here, despite the reader's moral repulsion of Macbeth, hey, pointing backwards to where I just came from, and yet giving the point of this paragraph, despite the reader's moral repulsion of Macbeth, there is still pleasure and admiration for the protagonist. Readers still experience pleasure and admiration for the protagonist. All right, so clean that up a little bit. Sometimes you need some time away, and then when you come back, you can clean it up. Despite the reader's moral, I don't like that it's reader. Despite this moral repulsion of Macbeth, readers still experience pleasure and admiration for the protagonist. All right, feeling good now. All right, so then I've got that. And then when I'm going to end that paragraph thinking about fighting in the face of certain defeat. I know I'm going to talk about even-handed justice. Though part of me says maybe to end with that the even-handed justice is that he dies and Malcolm is restored. Malcolm restored. Okay, now I know where I'm headed. So even-handed justice, we want to see punished. Then Malcolm is restored in the end. That's part of justice working its magic. So at the end of the day, I'm thinking about how do I go from saying justice is restored and that's part of our pleasure part of the pleasure we experience is that he dies. Shakespeare argues that humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. I need to stick with this. The even-handed justice thing feels like I'm starting, it's real easy to start saying like, well, maybe my takeaway should be about justice, and that good will win in the end. I mean, I guess, but that starts to feel like it's going away from the prompt and getting all excited of writing about justice in the end. So maybe feels like it's going to be easier to go from talking about wanting to see him punished, and then he fights against the impending doom, fighting in the face of certain defeat. And then here, Shakespeare argues that humans should both admire and condemn those few who are fearless. I feel like I need to talk about fear. Like here I'm talking about how he's unafraid of death, right? I've been talking around it, but I need to make sure that I actually I need to say the word fear in here, right? And the disquietude is the rash decisions he makes because he is fearless. Now you're probably noticing, this is getting really messy, Ms. Gallen. Yeah, this is how I plan. This is what real planning looks like. It is. It's a messy process, and that's okay. The main thing is that you see where your claims are. You know what order you're going to work them in. You got your examples down. But again, I need to link this to fear. So what I was doing, if you missed it, was I was thinking through the actual paper of my starting point of my thesis, and I didn't just say like, oh, and then I'll talk about these things, but I thought about like, okay, well, I'm going to start the paragraph here, but the last example I'm planning on going with is this. So how am I going to transition from like these ideas to this idea? And then if I treat it in this order, how am I going to go from fighting in the face of certain defeat to claiming this? And what I found was there was a little bit of a gap that I wasn't talking about fear. I guess I was talking near it, but I wasn't actually saying it. So I need to make sure I say it. Otherwise, this is going to feel like it comes out of left field when my reader reads my paper. Shakespeare argues that humans should both admire and condemn those who are fearless. I probably will get to this notion of the relief of the audience when Macbeth dies, because when he dies, the healthy confusion also dies. And that is, again, catharsis, an Aristotelian notion of the purpose of a tragedy. So it's nice that I can kind of throw in a little lingo there. I'll try to get some quotes in there. Yeah, it's messy, but that's going to be a solid essay. So you might be thinking about, I'm walking your way now. You might be thinking about like, Ms. Gallen, that took you a really long time to plan, and you said that we should try to keep our plan to like 12 minutes. You got to remember, number one, it's first period. I've only had 1 cup of coffee, so I'm a little slower than you'll be. And also, I didn't prepare for this. And talking your way through your thinking really slows down your thinking. So don't be worried that it's going to take you 45 minutes to plan. It takes me 45 minutes to talk out my thinking. But if you're really ready to go, it definitely is not going to take you this long to think it through, to write this out. So again, just last thing, the bell's about to ring. What we want to do in our plans is make sure we have addressed the part and the whole. You need to have it in sentence form. The claim for body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, maybe there'll be a third body paragraph for some of you. Mine is going to be 2 really substantial, meaty body paragraphs. I'm definitely responding to the prompt directly. So you need your claims in sentence form. Now when I'm done writing body paragraph 1...
We have a brief assembly this morning, so please head over to the auditorium. Thank you.
When I'm done writing body paragraph 1, I already have the first sentence of body paragraph 2 ready to go. I don't have to sit there and worry about it. Like, I've got it. I know exactly what I'm going to do. So, claims, and you want your specific examples, what you definitely want to hit. You want to think about that connection between body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, as you articulate the claim, and make sure you articulate that takeaway and the thesis. So that's the plan. Hope it helps.